Hi, this is Paul. This is going to be a little different video. This is on living stones and my vocation and some changes that may or may not be coming up. And because a good number of you who watch the channel also support the church in one way or another, I thought it's only fair to share this. I'm also going to share this on the church channel for those who watch the live stream. Sunday, we had a short congregational meeting after church where I presented some of this information. I didn't want to present it to the channel until I had first presented it to the church. But as I walk through, you'll see why I'm presenting it. I wrote this piece for a number of reasons: to get many of these ideas that I've been carrying around for a long time off my chest and onto paper, to share some thoughts with Living Stones and with other friends and ministry partners around the globe. I hope that this opens up new ideas, new possibilities, new scenarios, new opportunities, both for me and the people of Living Stones. But those of you who read it and are Christians should pray for me, for Living Stones, and for the ministry that has happened and will continue to happen, that God would bless these transitions and do great things. For those of you beyond Living Stones, please feel free to submit any feedback, do it in the comments, you can email me, whatever. You probably already know how to reach me. Life cycles. So basically what happened was, a few months ago, I asked the deacons, because I've been watching the financial reports, I asked the deacons to put together a one sheet of where our current income is and where our expenses are at, and if put down a nothing changes scenario. If nothing changes, then Living Stones can no longer operate with business as usual as of what date? And the deacons did this, and the date is September 2026. I knew this was coming. I've known this was coming for a number of years. Just recently, we had some very long-term faithful members they're aging. They're up in their 80s and 90s. There's transitions into skilled care facilities, some of these things, and I knew that with a number of these things that the overall picture would change. And so I did this to begin a conversation with the church, and also to include those of you who are interested. I guess if you're interested, you're still watching. If you're not interested, you've already clicked away, because a good number of people click away after the first 30 seconds of a video. And so we handed out that one sheet yesterday, and a one-page version of this much longer document that I had handed that out to the church. And it was most of the members were sort of quiet. This isn't the kind of news they want to hear. This is difficult. It needs change. I've spent a lot of years trying to maintain the ministry of the church as best I could for those members. And I've done other things in other venues. For example, worked on church planting, done the YouTube thing, worked in various denominational projects. I've been doing this kind of thing for better than 20 years. But now things are going to have to change locally. This year alone, we added 5 new members. 3 of them were adult baptisms. Those were all really good things. But at this point, probably not enough to change the overall trajectory of what's coming. So Living Stones and I have to have a longer conversation. Living Stones has been going for 62 years now, and over the last 30 years, there's always been enough money to meet our needs. Another response is, let's just grow our way out of this problem, which is a fine idea, but in many ways, that's what we've been trying to do for 28 years, and that I've been here, and for longer before that. It's probably not true that in the next year it will happen when it hasn't happened for the 28 years. Usually for an established church to hit a new cycle, a new growth phase, either you need a change in senior leadership and or a change in location. Churches themselves are very interesting. Churches are very interesting things. They are studied exhaustively in terms of change and growth, and there's innumerable strategies out there to help churches grow. The question of church growth and decline has been exhaustively studied in the United States, and over the years I've done much of that reading and learning. Churches are not primarily factories or vendors that you can just change to create a different result. They are worshiping communities with personalities, idiosyncrasies, cultures, habits, and often lifetimes. I could talk for a very long time about why our church is the way it is, which is very much the way we love it, and why we love it. If we didn't love it, we wouldn't be doing what we do for her. I've also known for a very long time that once an amazingly faithful giving base that has sustained this church for nearly 30 years, some of them 60 years, can no longer do so, then business as usual at Living Stones will end. When I came to Living Stones in 1997, most of the core leadership and membership of the church was in their 50s and 60s. Now add almost 30 years to that number, and many of those people are at a certain age. Another reality is that, well, other realities have to do with the neighborhood and neighborhood change. And again, I've been working on this for a very, very long time. Another reality is that a neighborhood church of our size and general culture in a moderately sized American city usually has a lifetime of about 60 years. What our church is going through is what thousands of other churches are at the same time. There are also many Christian Reformed churches like ours. There are a number of them in my classes that I'm working with classes on. Even as in our own classes that are facing similar decisions. Every situation is different, partly because every church is unique. Overall, we've done remarkably well to maintain the sort of ministry we've had in the context that we have. This is a credit to the leadership and the membership of the church. What this one sheet, that's a document, and asked the deacons to adjust it. The deacons were concerned about, well, how much detailed information do we want to throw out onto the open internet? I said, well, let's have another document that probably gives people a fair idea of, the budget of the church and how this works, so on and so forth. When it comes to decisions, one of the things that we need to mentally separate out is my future and the church's future. For years, I've done my best to try and help the church do ministry without disruptive change. I've worked a variety of jobs for the denomination, Sierra Leadership Network, Kingdom Enterprise Zone, that would bring income into the church to subsidize my salary and benefits. There have been a number of projects where I basically rent myself out to other organizations in the denomination, in the classes, and they pay me for my time. The money goes to the church to prop up my salary, so on and so forth. That would, and in some ways, YouTube has done a similar thing. That would bring income into the church to subsidize my salary and benefits. In latter years, though, the generosity of people who watch my YouTube channel, another stream of income, came to support the church. In recent years, when a long-term member passed away, they would give a generous gift to the church, which would help us through the COVID period. One way or another, we're able to maintain the status quo, for which we praise God. Also, I've had to quietly adjust to new financial realities over the years. A number of years ago, as denominational health insurance got more expensive and less generous, as a family, we moved to depending solely on my wife's health insurance from the school district. As the church continued to shrink, my wife's income became, on a percentage basis, a larger portion of our household income. In my father's and grandfather's day, the normal thing for a minister to do would be to move somewhere else in the country to get another or bigger church. Now, with the realities that most Americans have two-income households, the calling system in the Christian Reformed Church is no longer what it was. Ministers tend to be more locked into geographical areas. For my wife and I, at least until our retirement, we're probably going to have to stay in Sacramento, as her focus is not just her salary, but working her job to maximize her retirement income. She didn't start with the district right out of college, so she'll likely have to work until her retirement to get the full benefit of the district's retirement system. Over the last few years, I've supplemented my Living Stones income through my YouTube channel. I knew there'd be no room in our budget for any cost of living adjustments, and since YouTube and estuary work also blessed the church in a number of ways, it was a win-win. My current level of income from YouTube is at a level of inflation mitigation, not a replacement of my income at Living Stones. I can begin drawing on my pension at age 66 from the denomination. Currently, my pension will be between a quarter and a third of my current salary from Living Stones, and unfortunately, there isn't a cost of living adjustment built into the CRC pension. As you would imagine, my wife and I are focused now on figuring out what retirement will look like. Separating Living Stone's future from Paul's vocational future. We're at a point now where I can't simply subsidize the church by taking salary cuts to keep the status quo. Some things are going to have to change. Part of what we do is to ask more broadly for donations from partners and supporters beyond the local attenders but this will likely not address the structural realities in the financial picture. Even if I, through the generosity of people from YouTube, could, let's say, bring in enough steady income to just support the church, I don't think that would frankly be healthy for the church. While deriving some supplemental income from some other sources is good, I think frankly it's natural and healthy for a church to live off the donations of its membership. People giving to the church is part of their participation in the church, and it's part of their spiritual growth. To have a completely unsubsidized church, or a completely subsidized church, generally speaking, is not healthy for the church or healthy for the members. Another project I've been working on with Classes Central California is the development of a program that would help churches in situations such as ours. While Classes has not yet formally developed this program, I'm asking the Classical Established Church team to assist us in the process. This doesn't mean ongoing financial assistance or a bailout. It will likely come in the form of a counselor besides myself who can come alongside the church to help the church process the decisions it needs to make for herself. I don't have any details on this, but I hope in the next few months Classes will be able to come alongside to help us with it. What I want to emphasize is that ultimately the church has to make decisions for her future, and that decision matrix is separate from what I have to decide for my vocational future. It doesn't mean that I'm leaving. It just means those are two sets of questions that have to be dealt with. While they are connected to some degree, they also have to be respected as being separate. That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily leaving, just that there are two areas of decisions that need to be made. So the first thing we're going to do is lengthen the runway. The one-sheet document basically says, if nothing changes, then Living Stones will no longer be able to function as usual by September 2026. The purpose of what we are doing right now is to prepare for the changes that will certainly come. The first thing we'll do is try to lengthen the runway so that we will have a little, at least an amount of time in order to work through the decisions we need to make. This will involve a variety of common sense, low-hanging fruit decisions that Council has already made. Having a congregational meeting to ask our current membership to increase their local giving if possible. Make an appeal both through Sunday live streams and Paul's YouTube presence to ask those beyond our walls to make a donation. Council will provide appropriate financial reports publicly to help people decide on how they might give. At livingstonecrc.com/give, it's always in the notes below. Online giving is a great way to make a donation to the church. And I know a good many of you have done that over the years, and your donations have been appreciated. If you pay taxes in the United States, at the end of the calendar year, you'll get a tax receipt, which may or may not help you out on your taxes, depending on your current tax situation. But if you're interested in giving, please do so. It's greatly appreciated. But again, the purpose here is not to simply have the church live off a YouTube community. The church should live off its own worshiping community. That's a principal thing. Look at ways we can trim our already streamlined budget. Those aren't going to solve the problem. Do some estuary seminars to bring in some additional income. We've been talking about that. We haven't done one yet. As we look at the numbers, odds are probably break even at best with those seminars. We'll see how that goes. But most of these things are sort of lengthen the runway, make sure we have enough breathing room so that we can make the kinds of decisions we need to make over the next few years. While this should give the church some breathing room, it won't replace having to make decisions about how Living Stone structures and funds its ministry. Scenarios for differing levels of change for the church. Now, I'm already working on, you might ask, well, who will make these decisions? Well, the council of the church will make these decisions. And one of the things that I'm continuing to think through is that once the council is going to have to make this not just say a majority vote. Let's say you have options A, B, and C, and the church opts to C. The church is so small that if, let's say, church decides for option C, whatever that option might be, it might be that there are certain family and members that are integral for that plan, and if those people aren't committed for at least a couple of years for that option, then that plan isn't going to work. So it's going to be a complicated decision matrix that the church has to make. Below are some scenarios and explanations. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. There are more than I can articulate. There may be more than I can articulate here, but these can help the church come to a decision it will need to make over the next year. Number one, reset to emerging church or chapel status. Living Stones right now is a small worshiping community that has attached itself to a full-time minister. For a variety of historic and economic reasons, that scenario is increasingly less common in America today. Most churches in our neighborhood of our size have bivocational ministers and meet in rented facilities. If they manage to grow large enough, usually above 200 in attendance, they will usually secure their first owned property. Their clergy generally don't have a graduate level theological degree. In this scenario, Paul would move on from his current employment, and Living Stones would look for someone who would be willing to work at a much lower salary level. The church would revert to emerging status, having another council of neighboring churches, probably Christ Church Davis or Granite Springs, call and supervise the new pastor. That pastor would need to be ordained or at least a commissioned pastor in the CRC. Pros. This is the most status quo option, in that the basic ministry shape of the church won't change in terms of weekly worship services, Bible studies, etc. Besides Paul no longer being your pastor, this fresh vision would bring some, might bring some new growth and potentially a future of the church at its current location. Cons. A pastoral transition is difficult. A sufficient group of current membership would have to want this because of the current size of the church and because some people often leave the church because of a pastoral transition. The church would need to be all in on such a plan. If the church lost half of its already small membership in the transition, this option would work. It would also be difficult to find someone to work bivocationally would give the church a decent chance at future growth. It would take the right mix of person and place to make it work. Recently, we had one of our church plants that got to this size, and the founding pastor decided to leave that ministry. They called someone, and it's just a risky proposition. You don't know if that new person is going to work. Also, partly because the church, it's a bivocational call. Your pool is limited. There have to be alignment with the Christian Reformed Church. It's sort of the most status quo, but it's the riskiest. We'll have to see how that one goes. Many churches that try this won't make it long term. There are often a series of attempts at new leadership, but over time, morale and energy decline, and the church winds up closing. That's what happened with that church plant. Locally, that didn't make it. Major campus renovations to generate income for the church. There are a few sub-scenarios in this. It is often the case that churches reach the end of their life cycle if they have no debt and some facility assets that they can extend their life cycle and hope for something to come in the future to reset the scenario. Seller developed the undeveloped lot in the parking lot. The fastest way to raise money would be simply to sell the lot to a developer. Given the demand for housing, this would likely be an extend the runway option. Another idea kicked around has been for the church to develop the lot with an apartment housing. There are currently state and city initiatives to incentivize the sort of infill development. There are real complexities to these difficulties that we can foresee in our location by the executive airport flight path. There's been a developer that's been trying to buy our property for a number of years. They had bought portions of the property that the church had bought many years ago, and that portion was developed. It's difficult to develop because we're actually close to an executive airport. There had been a tragic accident in the 1970s that had sort of strengthened some of the laws and regulations about flight paths. So actually developing the property next to the church was more difficult than the developer had anticipated. So us putting in something else might be difficult because of the flight paths. It's also the case that a small church like ours isn't necessarily skilled in being a good landlord. It is uncertain how much monthly income would be generated by that property, and we have no idea how long such a plan would require to bring to fruition. We don't know that we have the runway to complete this. Now, in the past, we have rented to we've rented to childcare centers, we've rented to other churches. It's not a cash cow of sorts. Renting to childcare, organizations has had a mixed result. Both times that we've done it, the church has probably lost money. And part of what we realized the second time that we rented to a child care center was we just don't have, there wasn't enough money in it to, let's say, hire a full-time property manager who could maintain it at the level that was needed and for the church to make the kind of income it needs to make. And so in that way, and also the church wasn't a particularly good landlord in that the property is aging, there are issues with it. Some of the buildings, for example, one of the buildings that was mostly used for the child care center. Child care centers have state regulations with respect to heating and cooling, and the lack of insulation and the poor windows in that building basically meant that we couldn't cool that building sufficiently for them. Redevelop the nursery and education building as rental spaces for other churches to bring in more rental income. We currently have 2 buildings on the facility that are underutilized. The nursery building could be remodeled to become space where another small church could rent space from us. Renting to churches, everybody wants Sunday morning except for the Adventists that want Saturday morning. We've rented to Adventist churches in the past, and that's brought in some income. But again, most of the churches in our neighborhood are small, struggling immigrant churches that don't tend to have a lot of money for anything. They have bivocational pastors or volunteer pastors, and what little money they bring in, they offer some. We have a Nigerian church currently that rents from us, and while the rental that they pay is welcome, it doesn't make an appreciable difference in the budget. There's a real need for worship space for the kinds of churches in our area. The Anglican church that currently rents from us is a great example, because Sunday is a central day for churches to worship. Church worship spaces that can house between 20 and 50 are at a premium, and we could potentially rent to 2 or 4 of such groups. We'd probably need to borrow on the value of our current facility to raise the money to do needed renovations. We might be able to do it with cash on hand or with runway money, but that involves risks and takes time. Many of these groups have little money to pay rent, and they've experienced it in the past. Not only, and so we had one group, Pacific Island group, that rented from us, rented the large room. They just didn't quite have the idea of paying rent, and they never did. They had like a nice 6 months of free use of the facilities, but again, of course, that costs us. We are currently renting to the Anglicans, probably under market value for such a space, probably not as under market value as some might think. Groups come and go, and there's additional elements and liability to such groups as well as administrative needs. How much money could reasonably raise to both pay for the development costs and provide immediate income is unknown at this time. Sell the property, downsize, and or restart. Churches seldom appreciate the fact that their facility asset is a ministry asset. While I don't know the current value of our property on Florin Road in Amherst, even before I came to the church has had interested buyers for the property. We're right on a major corner, and so there would be a lot of interest in the property once we put it up for sale. If the church sold the property, that money could be used to plant a new church. A world of decisions would need to be made about this scenario. Where would we like to plant? Same neighborhood, Elk Grove, Natomas, Midtown, Woodland, Rancho Cordova, etc. Who would the leader be? Would Paul like to do this? Is he too old and tired? What sort of model would it be? Could the internet presence be an asset towards something like this? In what way would this still be living stones? Downsize, sell the facilities and free up a lot of staff, program resources. The storefront would have some office space and space it out for Sunday morning gathering, on weekends, coffee break, estuary, etc., etc. A little bit more exposure, could potentially add some new people. There are leasing costs, but the maintenance and overhead on a smaller lease space requires less volunteer maintenance, and parking usually works out well because Sunday AM isn't prime time for a lot of strip mall retail. 4, more partnerships that generate income, interns and students doing ministry. This is a sense that this is something that's been happening for the last 20 years. Paul could take other employment with other CRC agencies and churches that wish to employ him for one task or another. This would either make Paul either formally or functionally bivocational at Living Stones. Interns and students might be able to be brought in to supplement the preaching, pastoral care, other tasks. Pros, worship, and ministry could still continue at Living Stones with a fair amount of continuity. Interns and students might breathe new life into the ministry and attract a new group, possibly giving the church a new life cycle. One of these students, interns, may eventually become senior pastor when Paul retires in a few years. Cons, it's high risk, high reward strategy that we don't have that other paying element currently. We'd have to find that piece or a group of pieces within the runway period for the scenario to work. There would be transition for the church, and that Paul would be less available to do what he does now, and our membership would have to get used to students and interns, and we'd have to raise money for their support too in doing ministry in place of Paul. 5, closer, merger, Sacramento cluster. Together with other denominational partners, Living Stones has spent the last 28 years involved in church planting in Sacramento. We've been part of a team. The facility asset we currently own could be used to help strengthen and support the broader Sacramento ministry efforts. In other words, the other churches in Sacramento. This scenario would go something like this. Living Stones as a worshiping community would close and sell its property. The money would go to one of our other local cluster churches to administer, and Paul's credential and supervision would be passed on to one of those churches. Members of Living Stones would transfer their membership to one of these churches, or to River Rock, which is a church that had been an organized church and has reverted to emerging church, went to a different facility, and is doing pretty well in their new facility, their new rental space. And this kind of thing is not unusual, and with the church plants that we've worked in, we've seen a number of these scenarios. None of them have sold and owned property, though, to transition for it. That's what's different about this situation. Possibly renting a smaller space near the current site to do some other small things, similar to the previous scenario. Paul would continue to develop his internet ministry with time freed up with no longer having as many local ministry obligations. There could be other online church options, as was discussed in the virtual ministry task force document that Synod processed. While worship services would obviously no longer happen as Living Stones, Bible studies and other things could continue online and at other church locations. Paul would be available for Christ Church Davis, Folsom River Rock, Granite Springs, to help serve in the ongoing development of the cluster. It's our desire that we would continue to plant new churches in the Sacramento area. While Paul would likely not be the church planter, he could assist in this effort. Paul would also help support these churches, starting estuary groups, if they desire. Should be they. And Paul would continue to support the creation of estuary groups worldwide as he's doing now. That would free up, that'd be more free to, let's say, get out to the estuary, get out to the breakwater group in Europe. You know, there's a couple of groups. I basically would be more free to do more estuary work. The funds released by the sale of the property would go towards supporting Paul's salary and the development of cluster and estuary ministry in Sacramento. So I'm 4 years from retirement now in terms of being able to draw a pension from the denomination. At the end of the runway, I'd be 3 years. So figuring out what to do with that gap is got to figure that out. Paul's going to have some decisions to make. It's been a priority of mine to keep Living Stones going as long as possible with the same people in ministry format. The church has blessed me in so many ways and been very good to me and my family for a very long time, and I'm deeply grateful. I also have to wrestle with the needs of my family and my calling from God to ministry. As I mentioned above, I see the work God has done through estuary and the internet ministry as providing a lot of unique ministry opportunities, which would end if I abandon it to take another call, or let's say another CRC church calls me, and then unless they would want me to continue to do what I'm doing, a larger church obviously would require more local responsibilities. The different scenarios above obviously impact me in different ways. As I mentioned, it's one minister on CRC Voices also said, "You're 62. A lot of churches don't want to call a pastor at your age." My father managed it. He was 4 years away from retirement. He took only his second church, and that was a blessing for him before he retired. And my Um, my parents then relocated in retirement and lived where my mother currently lives now. Different scenarios above obviously impact me in different ways. As I mentioned, it's a priority for my wife and I to stay in Sacramento because of her career, retirement needs, and the present location of most of our children. As I said at the outset of this rather long paper, that the decision matrix for me and Livingstone's are separate. Livingstone's needs to decide as a church what is best for her. Some of the scenarios above don't really include me because of situation or fit. Other scenarios do include me. In any scenario in which I am not a part, I will be fine. I can find ways to generate more income from my internet presence. There are, I haven't really done any writing. I can start doing some writing. That would probably bring in some, start selling some books. There are possibly other churches in the denomination who might like the possibilities I bring to something creative in terms of internet ministry. I only have 4 years until I'm able to receive pension income and Social Security income. So, yeah, it's obviously this might also impact the YouTube channel. Because I am presently the only minister in the Christian Reformed Church who is doing this, I am reluctant to stop doing this. I am also reluctant to only do this. I really want to keep, as long as possible, the posture of both doing ministry on the ground and ministry on the internet. So that's kind of where things are at. And so if you feel so moved, livingstonecrc.com/give. You can make a donation to the church. Just make a donation to the general fund. That would be fine. And that helps. At least I actually think the deacons forecast is rosy. And my concern was that, there's a fair amount of denial and avoidance with an issue like this. And what can sometimes happen is that the church then, they can't make pay. And they can. The payroll is mostly me. There's a few other people. We've got janitorial, musician, secretarial. We've got some other small staff costs here too. But then suddenly, we can't pay Paul. Okay, what do we do? And then the church feels embarrassed and doesn't know what to do. And that's not the way you want to head into a situation like this. And I actually think that some of these scenarios and potentially other scenarios, there could be some really interesting forms of ministry that actually could, I think, probably grow. Churches are very complex individual things. Neighborhoods change, ministry models change, cultures change. Fit is always a big deal. And so, we'll... And every congregation, so you've got basically about 40 people who are going to have to make this decision together. And it'll be interesting. So those of you who pray, keep us in prayer. For those of you who'd like to participate in extending the runway, livingstonecrc.com/give. And I presented this first to the congregation because it's theirs. I also posted this on CRC Voices to see what kind of interesting responses there might be. For the church membership, these kinds of moves are always difficult because you lose so much morale when you sort of decide, okay, we're going to dispel the avoidance and the denial, and we're going to look at this thing up front. And so you want to make that move carefully. But it's time to make that move. And you lose morale because people are like, what if I lose my church? And obviously the people who go here, they love their church. They love the other people of the church. The thought of their own church closing, it's a gut punch. And but it's time for the church to face some facts and to see what other things can arise. And part of the reason I put it out on the internet is you don't know what opportunities can arise. Um, you just never know. So, yeah. Thanks for listening. And I'm really interested to see what the comments are going to look like.